The morning Clara Bennett pushed her bread cart onto the dusty main street of Silver Creek, Montana Territory in the summer of 1876, she had no idea that the massive stranger, watching from the shadow of the general store, would change everything about her carefully ordered widow's life. Clara had been selling bread from her wooden cart for 8 months now, ever since her husband Thomas died in a mining accident that left her with nothing but debts and a small rented room above the seamstress shop. At 24 years old, she had already learned that survival meant rising at 3 in the morning to knead dough, meant ignoring the pitying stares of townspeople who remembered when she had been a merchant's wife with prospects. Her hands were rough now, flour perpetually dusted under her fingernails, and her dark blonde hair stayed pinned in a simple bun because she had no time for vanity. But her bread was honest and good, each loaf baked with the careful attention her mother had taught her back in Pennsylvania, before Clara had followed Thomas west with dreams that died as quickly as he had. The cart's wheels creaked as she positioned it near the bank, where foot traffic ran heaviest. 6 loaves of wheat bread, 4 of sourdough, and 2 special rye loaves that took extra effort but rarely sold. She arranged them carefully on the clean cloth, then stood back and waited, her worn calico dress already clinging to her shoulders in the building heat. "Fresh bread," she called out, her voice steady despite the nervousness that never quite left her stomach. "Baked this morning." The town was waking around her. Horses stamped at hitching posts, storekeepers swept their doorways, and somewhere down the street, a hammer rang against an anvil in steady rhythm. Silver Creek had boomed with the discovery of silver in the surrounding mountains 3 years ago, and though some of the initial frenzy had died down, it remained a rough town full of miners, gamblers, and men looking to make their fortunes. Clara kept her eyes down mostly, spoke politely, made her sales, and went home. It was safer that way. She sold 2 loaves in the first hour, both to Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house and always bought in bulk. The coins clinked into Clara's apron pocket with a satisfying weight. She was counting what she would need for more flour when a shadow fell across her cart, so large it blocked the sun. Clara looked up and up further still. The man standing before her was the biggest human being she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span half the width of her cart. His chest was broad beneath a worn leather vest, his arms thick with muscle that spoke of years of hard physical labor. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, partially tied back but still wild, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. His skin was weathered and tanned deep brown from constant sun exposure. But it was his eyes that caught her, pale blue like glacier ice, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "How much for all of it?" His voice was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together, but not unkind. Clara blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "All your bread, every loaf." "How much?" She quickly calculated in her head, her merchant's daughter training surfacing automatically. "That would be $4 for everything I have left." Without a word, the mountain man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out 4 silver dollars and placed them on her cart with surprising gentleness for such large hands. His fingers were scarred, she noticed, marked with the evidence of a hard life. "But sir, that's 10 loaves. Surely you don't need—" "I need them." He gathered the loaves carefully, tucking them into a canvas sack he pulled from his belt. "You make good bread. Heard about it up at the mining camp." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "Thank you. I try to keep the quality high." He nodded once, then turned to leave. Clara watched him go, this giant of a man moving through the street with surprising grace. People stepped aside for him automatically, not out of fear exactly, but out of recognition that here was someone who belonged more to the wild mountains than to civilization. "That's Elijah Stone," a voice said beside her. Clara turned to find Mr. Peterson from the dry goods store standing there with his broom. "Mountain man, trapper, comes into town maybe once every 2 months for supplies, lives up somewhere in the high country, keeps to himself mostly." "He bought all my bread," Clara said, still slightly stunned. "Huh, that's odd. Elijah Stone isn't known for being social or doing unusual things. He gets his supplies and leaves, doesn't talk much." Mr. Peterson shrugged and went back to his sweeping. Clara looked down at the 4 silver dollars gleaming in her hand. She had made half her usual daily income in a single sale, and it was barely past 9 in the morning. She should have been pleased, should have packed up her cart and gone home to start tomorrow's baking. Instead, she found herself staring down the street where the massive mountain man had disappeared, wondering what he could possibly need with 10 loaves of bread. She went home that day with questions she could not answer, and an image burned in her mind of pale blue eyes watching her with curious intensity. The next morning, Clara was up at her usual 3 o'clock hour, lighting the small stove in the corner of her room that served as both heat and oven. The space was cramped, barely large enough for a bed, a table, and her baking supplies, but it was hers and the rent was manageable if she was careful. She mixed her dough with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind wandered to places she usually kept locked away. Thomas had been gone for 8 months. Their marriage had not been the love story she had once dreamed of as a girl reading novels by candlelight. He had been restless, always chasing the next opportunity, always sure that fortune was just around the next corner. They had moved from Pennsylvania to St. Louis, from St. Louis to Denver, from Denver finally to Silver Creek, where Thomas was convinced the silver mines would make them rich. Instead, a tunnel collapse had made her a widow and left her with debts that took every penny she could scrape together to settle. She did not miss him the way she thought a wife should miss a dead husband. She missed the idea of security, of partnership, of not facing the world alone. But Thomas himself, the man who forgot her birthday and spent their food money on cards and never quite looked at her the way she had once hoped to be looked at, that man she had already mourned long before his death. The dough rose while she dozed in her chair, then she shaped it into loaves and set them to bake. By the time the sun was painting the eastern sky pink and gold, she had 12 perfect loaves, cooled and ready. She loaded them onto her cart and made her way to the main street, her muscles remembering the route, even though her mind was still foggy with insufficient sleep. She had barely finished arranging her bread when the shadow fell across her cart again. Elijah Stone stood before her in the early morning light, looking just as massive and wild as he had the day before. His pale blue eyes met hers, and something in her chest did an unexpected flip. "Morning," he said in that deep, rough voice. "Good morning," Clara replied, forcing herself to sound normal. "You're up early." "Always am. How much for everything?" Clara stared at him. "You want all my bread again?" "Yes." "But you bought everything yesterday. Surely you couldn't have eaten it all already, and even if you stored it, bread doesn't keep well in this heat." "How much?" he repeated, not unkindly, but with a firmness that suggested he would not be questioned. She told him the price. He paid it, this time in a mix of silver and gold coins that spoke of success in his trapping business. He loaded the bread into his canvas sack with the same careful movements, as though the loaves were precious. "Sir, Mr. Stone, I don't understand." "Elijah," he corrected. "Just Elijah." "Elijah, then. Why are you buying all my bread? It seems wasteful." For a moment she thought he would not answer. He finished packing the bread, then looked at her with those intense pale eyes. "Your bread is good, best I have tasted in years, and you need the money more than I need it. Seems fair." Before she could formulate a response to that unexpected statement, he was walking away again, his long legs carrying him down the street toward the edge of town where the wilderness began. Clara stood frozen beside her empty cart. He knew she needed the money. Of course he did. Everyone in Silver Creek knew about the widow Bennett struggling to pay her debts. But something about the way he said it, matter of fact and without pity, made it feel less like charity and more like a simple transaction between equals. She should have been offended. She should have refused his money if it was truly just charity. But $4 was $4, and pride did not pay the rent. The pattern continued. Every morning for the next week, Clara baked her bread and brought it to the street. Every morning, Elijah Stone appeared shortly after sunrise and bought every single loaf. They exchanged few words beyond the basic transaction, but Clara found herself watching for him, found herself arranging her hair with a bit more care and choosing her better dress instead of the one with the frayed hem. On the 8th morning, after he had paid and packed his bread, Clara gathered her courage. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" The words tumbled out before she could second-guess them. "There's a cafe just down the street. I would like to thank you properly for your business." Elijah paused, his hand on the canvas sack. For a long moment he said nothing, and Clara felt her face burn with embarrassment. Of course he would not want to sit with her. He was clearly doing this out of some misguided kindness, and she had misread the situation entirely. "All right," he said finally. "Coffee would be good." The cafe was a small establishment run by a German couple, the Mullers, who made strong coffee and decent pastries. At this early hour, they were the only customers. Clara chose a table by the window where the morning light streamed in, and they sat across from each other in the ladder-back chairs. Elijah looked enormous in the small chair, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as though he was trying to make himself fit in a space designed for smaller men. Mrs. Muller brought them coffee in thick ceramic mugs, her eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of the widow Bennett sitting with the wild mountain man, but she said nothing. "How long have you lived in the mountains?" Clara asked, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Most of my life. 20 years, maybe more. Lost count." He sipped his coffee, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the cup. "You don't get lonely?" "No." He said it simply, as fact. "Mountains are peaceful, quiet. I have my traps, my cabin, the animals. It is enough." Clara tried to imagine such a life and could not. She had always lived in towns, surrounded by people, by the noise and bustle of civilization. "What made you come down this week? You don't usually come to town often, I heard." Something shifted in his expression, a slight curve of his lips beneath his beard that might have been a smile. "Had a reason." "The bread?" She said it skeptically. "The bread," he confirmed, "and other things." "What other things?" Now he definitely smiled, a flash of white teeth in the dark beard. "Maybe I will tell you someday." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments. Clara studied him over the rim of her mug. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his hair was shot through with just a few threads of silver, despite him appearing to be in his early 30s. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years older than her, she estimated. His hands rested on the table, large and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard and lived harder. "Why did you really buy all my bread?" she asked quietly. "And please do not tell me it is just because you like it. No one needs that much bread." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "You remind me that there is goodness in the world," he said finally, his rough voice even rougher with something that might have been emotion. "You lost your husband, lost your security, but you got up and you baked bread and you did what you had to do to survive. That takes strength. I respect strength." Clara felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "I'm not strong. I'm just trying not to drown. That is what strength looks like. The trying." He finished his coffee and set down the mug. "I grew up back east, Philadelphia. My father was a drunk who beat my mother until she stopped getting up one day. I was 14. I came west and never looked back. Built a life in the mountains where no one could touch me, where I answered to no one. But sometimes I forget why I survived, why I kept going. Then I came into town last month and saw you with your cart, your chin up, your eyes fierce even though I could see you were tired. And I remembered." She had not expected such honesty, such raw truth laid bare over coffee in a small cafe. "I'm sorry about your mother. Long time ago, but I learned that the people who keep going, who keep trying, they are the ones worth knowing, worth helping if I can." He stood, his chair scraping against the wood floor. "Thank you for the coffee, Clara." He had never used her name before. The sound of it in his deep voice did strange things to her equilibrium. "Thank you for listening, Elijah." He nodded once, paid Mrs. Muller for both their coffees despite Clara's protests, and left. Clara sat alone at the table, watching through the window as he walked toward the mountains, and felt something shift inside her chest, like a door long locked was starting to open. The next morning, Elijah did not come. Clara set up her cart and waited, trying to ignore the sinking disappointment in her stomach. She told herself she was being foolish. He had probably gone back to his cabin in the mountains, back to his solitary life. The bread buying had been a strange interlude, and now it was over. She sold loaves throughout the morning to her regular customers, but her eyes kept drifting to the edge of town, watching for a tall figure that never appeared. By noon, she packed up her remaining bread and went home, feeling more deflated than she wanted to admit. But the next morning, he was there. He appeared out of the morning mist like a conjured spirit, solid and real, and the relief that flooded through Clara was almost embarrassing in its intensity. "Thought you had gone back to the mountains," she said, trying to sound casual. "Went up to check my traps, came back." He surveyed her bread. "Looks good as always." "You don't have to keep buying everything, you know. I'm managing all right. I know I do not have to. I want to." He pulled out his coin purse. "How much?" They fell into a new pattern after that. Elijah would come down from the mountains every few days, buy all her bread, and they would have coffee at the Muller's Cafe. Slowly, bit by bit, Clara learned about his life. He trapped beaver and fox and occasionally bear, selling the pelts to traders who came through. He had a cabin built with his own hands near a stream, surrounded by pine trees and mountain peaks. He read books, which surprised her, a collection he had built up over years of occasional purchases from trading posts and towns. He could go weeks without seeing another human being and be perfectly content. In turn, she told him about Pennsylvania, about her father's mercantile business and how she had learned numbers and trade by standing at his elbow, about Thomas and the restless energy that had driven them west, about the mining accident and the debts and the terrifying moment when she realized she was utterly alone. "You are not alone now," Elijah said one morning over coffee, his blue eyes serious. "You have friends in this town. Mrs. Muller, she asks about you. Mr. Peterson, he makes sure no one bothers you on the street, and you have me if you want." "Do I?" Clara asked, her heart beating fast. "Have you, I mean?" "If you want," he repeated softly. "I'm not an easy man, Clara. I live a hard life in the mountains. I'm not good with words or society manners, but I know what I see when I look at you, and I know what I feel. If you need a friend, I'm here." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough, and his fingers curled gently around hers, completely engulfing her smaller hand. "I need a friend," she whispered. "I need this." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Clara felt it settle into her bones, felt the careful walls she had built around her heart after Thomas's death begin to crack. The weeks passed into a month, then 2 months. Summer deepened into the hot, dry days of late August. Elijah continued to come down from his mountains, and Clara continued to bake her bread. But now when he bought her loaves, he stayed. They walked together through the town, drawing curious stares. They sat on the bench outside the general store and talked about everything and nothing. He told her about tracking a mountain lion for 3 days, and she told him about the time she had accidentally mixed salt and sugar and created the worst cookies in Pennsylvania history. "I would have eaten them," Elijah said, his eyes crinkling with rare humor. "They were terrible. Even our dog would not touch them. I still would have eaten them, if you made them." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. Elijah had a way of saying simple things that carried enormous weight. He did not use flowery language or pretty words, but when he said he would have eaten her terrible cookies, she heard what he was really saying. "I value what you create. I value you." One evening in early September, after she had sold her last loaf to a miner's wife, Elijah appeared with 2 horses. One was his own massive gelding, a horse that had to be at least 17 hands high to carry his weight. The other was a pretty chestnut mare with a gentle eye. "Come riding with me," he said. "I want to show you something." Clara had not been on a horse since coming to Silver Creek. Thomas had sold their wagon and horses within a month of arriving, sure he would strike it rich and be able to afford better. She felt nervous as Elijah helped her mount, his strong hands steadying her, but the mare stood patient and calm. They rode out of town as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Elijah led them along a trail that wound up into the foothills, gaining elevation steadily. Clara had to focus on her riding, trusting the mare to follow Elijah's gelding, but gradually she relaxed into the rhythm and began to notice her surroundings. The mountains rose around them in magnificent waves of stone and forest. Pine trees towered overhead, their needles releasing sharp, clean scent into the cooling air. A stream chattered somewhere nearby, invisible but musical. Wildflowers still bloomed in patches where the sun broke through the canopy, painting splashes of purple and yellow and red across the forest floor. After about an hour, Elijah guided them off the main trail onto a smaller path that opened suddenly into a meadow. Clara caught her breath. The meadow was perhaps an acre across, carpeted in grass that had gone golden with the season. It sat on the side of the mountain, and from its edge she could see down the valley to where Silver Creek lay like a toy town in the distance. Above, the peaks rose in purple majesty, their tops touched with the pink and gold of sunset. "This is beautiful," Clara breathed. Elijah dismounted and came to help her down. His hands spanned her waist as he lifted her from the saddle, and for a moment they stood very close, her hands resting on his broad shoulders for balance. His eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. "This is where I come when the cabin feels too small," he said quietly. "When I need to think. I wanted you to see it." They let the horses graze and sat together at the edge of the meadow, watching the sun paint the sky in impossible colors. Clara was acutely aware of Elijah beside her, his solid warmth, the way his shoulder nearly touched hers. The air was cooling rapidly now that the sun was setting, and she shivered slightly. Without a word, Elijah shrugged off his leather vest and draped it around her shoulders. It was enormous on her, still warm from his body, and carried his scent of pine smoke and leather and something wild and clean that was just him. "Thank you," she said softly. "Clara," he said her name like a prayer. "I need to tell you something." Her heart was beating so hard, she was sure he must be able to hear it. "All right? That first day I saw you with your cart, I'd come into town planning to get my supplies and leave within the hour. I always do. Towns make me restless, too many people, too much noise. But then I saw you standing there with your bread, and something in my chest just stopped." He paused, his jaw working as though the words were difficult. "You looked so fierce and so tired at the same time. Your hair was coming loose from your pins, and you had flour on your cheek, and you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Clara could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at his profile as he looked out over the valley. "I bought your bread because I wanted a reason to stand close to you," he continued. "I kept buying it because I kept finding excuses to come back to town, which I never do. I kept coming back because somewhere in the past 2 months, I stopped being able to imagine my days without seeing your face." "Elijah," she whispered. He turned to face her fully, and the vulnerability in his pale blue eyes nearly undid her. "I know I am not what a woman like you should want. I'm rough and scarred, and I live in the wilderness. I cannot offer you a fine house in town or society dinners, but I can offer you everything I have, my protection, my loyalty, my respect, and my heart if you will take it, because it is already yours, Clara, has been since that first morning." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was smiling so wide it hurt. "You think you are not what I should want. Elijah, you are everything I did not know I needed. You are kind and strong and honest. You see me, truly see me, not just the widow or the baker or the woman who needs help. You see Clara, just Clara, and you think that is enough." "It is more than enough," he said roughly. "You are everything." She did not know which of them moved first. Suddenly, his arms were around her and her face was buried against his broad chest, and she was crying in earnest now, releasing months of fear and loneliness and exhaustion. His hand stroked her hair gently, and he murmured soft words she could not quite hear but felt in her bones. When she finally pulled back enough to look up at him, his eyes were bright with emotion. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her. His lips were gentle despite his size, soft and questioning. Clara kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt the last walls around her heart crumble entirely. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "Say you will try this with me. Say you will let me court you proper." "Yes," Clara said, laughing through the last of her tears. "Yes, Elijah, yes to all of it." They rode back to town in the darkness, the horses sure-footed on the familiar trail. Elijah kept his gelding close beside her mare, his hand occasionally reaching out to touch her arm or shoulder, as though reassuring himself she was real. When they reached the edge of Silver Creek, he helped her dismount and walked her to the seamstress shop where she rented her room. "I will be back in 3 days," he said, holding both her hands in his. "I need to check my trap lines and bring down some pelts to sell. But then I'm coming back, and I'm taking you to dinner at the hotel restaurant. A proper date." Clara smiled up at him, this massive mountain man who had somehow captured her heart with bread purchases and honest words. "I will be waiting." He kissed her once more, soft and sweet, then mounted his gelding and rode into the darkness. Clara climbed the stairs to her room floating on air, her lips still tingling, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The next 3 days passed in a blur of baking and anticipation. Clara found herself humming while she kneaded dough, smiling at customers, seeing the world in brighter colors. Mrs. Muller noticed and commented with a knowing twinkle in her eye. Mr. Peterson made a point of mentioning that Elijah Stone was a good man, rough around the edges but honorable. Even the stern-faced banker's wife, Mrs. Whitmore, who normally looked down her nose at Clara's trade, gave her a small nod of acknowledgement on the street. On the third evening, Clara put on her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes. She arranged her hair carefully, pinning it up in a style that was more elaborate than her usual practical bun. She had no jewelry except her thin wedding band, which she had continued to wear more out of habit than sentiment. She looked at it now, twisting it on her finger. Thomas felt like another lifetime, another person's story. She slid the ring off and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her few valuables. It was time to move forward. Elijah arrived exactly when he said he would, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and vest, his hair neatly tied back. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers that must have taken him considerable effort to gather. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes going wide as he took her in. "You look very handsome yourself," Clara replied, accepting the flowers and wishing she had a proper vase to put them in. She settled for a water pitcher, arranging them quickly before taking Elijah's offered arm. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Silver Creek, which admittedly was not saying much, but they had real tablecloths and printed menus and candles on the tables. Elijah held out Clara's chair for her, then folded himself into his own seat with the air of a man entering foreign territory. She found his discomfort oddly endearing. "Do you do this often?" she asked, glancing around at the other diners. "Come to restaurants?" "Never," he admitted. "I eat at my cabin. Sometimes at a saloon if I need hot food in town, but not places like this." "Then why are we here?" He met her eyes across the table. "Because you deserve nice things, deserve to be treated properly. I might not know much about courting, but I know that." Her heart melted a little more. They ordered dinner, simple fare of steak and potatoes, and talked easily despite the formal surroundings. Elijah told her about his trap lines and the fox den he had discovered. Clara told him about Mrs. Henderson's daughter who was getting married and had asked her to bake the bread for the wedding breakfast. "That is good," Elijah said. "Means your reputation is growing. Soon you will have more business than you can handle alone." Clara had not thought that far ahead. She was still living day to day, focused on making enough to pay her rent and buy supplies. "I suppose I should think about the future more." "You should, because I am thinking about it." Elijah's hand reached across the table to cover hers. "I'm thinking about how you might need a bigger space for baking, maybe a proper kitchen, maybe a home." Clara's breath caught. "Elijah Stone, are you proposing to me over dinner on our first official date?" He had the grace to look sheepish. "No, maybe. I do not know how this works, Clara, but I am a practical man. I know what I want, and I do not see the point in pretending otherwise. I want a life with you. Want to wake up and see your face, want to come home from the trap lines to you, want to build something real and lasting." "We have only known each other for 2 months, she said softly, but her heart was singing. "I have known you long enough, but I understand if you need more time. I can wait. I am patient." Clara thought about her life before Elijah, the gray tedium of survival, the loneliness that had settled into her bones. She thought about how he had seen her struggling and had found a way to help that preserved her dignity. How he listened when she talked and remembered small details. How his eyes softened when he looked at her, and how safe she felt in his presence. "I do not need more time," she said clearly. "I know my heart, Elijah. It is yours." His fingers tightened on hers, and the smile that broke across his face transformed him from intimidating to beautiful. "You mean that?" "I mean it. But I think we should still court properly for a while. I want to see your cabin, meet your life. I want you to be sure this is what you want, bringing a woman into your solitary world." "I am sure," he said firmly. "But you are right. You should see how I live. The cabin is rough, Clara. It is not fancy." "I do not need fancy. I need real." They finished their dinner in happy agreement, making plans. Elijah would take her up to his cabin the following week, a 2-day visit so she could see his home and decide if she could imagine living there. They would take things slow despite their certainty, out of respect for the newness of their relationship. When he walked her home that night, he kissed her under the stars, and Clara felt her future unfold before her like the pages of a beloved book. The following week, Clara made arrangements with Mrs. Henderson to take over her bread cart for a few days. She packed a simple bag, dressed in her most practical clothing, and met Elijah at dawn outside the livery stable. The same gentle chestnut mare was saddled and waiting for her. "She's yours now," Elijah said, stroking the mare's neck. "I bought her last week. Figured you would need a horse if you're going to visit the mountains." "Elijah, horses are expensive. Her name is Honey because of her color. Do you like her?" Clara looked into the mare's soft brown eyes and felt instant affection. "I love her, thank you." They rode out of Silver Creek into the crystalline morning, heading up into the mountains on trails that grew progressively narrower and steeper. Elijah led the way on his massive gelding, frequently looking back to check on Clara, but Honey was as sure-footed and gentle as he had promised. As they climbed higher, the air grew cooler and thinner, scented with pine and wild earth. Eagles soared overhead, and once Clara spotted a deer watching them from the shadows of the trees. Around midday, they stopped beside a stream to rest and water the horses. Elijah unpacked food from his saddlebags, simple fare of jerky and hardtack and apples, but Clara was hungry enough that it tasted wonderful. They sat on sun-warmed rocks and ate while the stream sang its rushing song beside them. "How much further?" Clara asked. "Another 3 hours. We will arrive before dark." He studied her face. "Are you sore? Not used to riding?" "A little sore," she admitted, "but I will survive. We can rest longer if you need." "I am fine, Elijah. Stop worrying." He smiled slightly. "I will always worry about you. Get used to it." They mounted up and continued climbing. The landscape grew more rugged and wild, fewer signs of human presence. They passed abandoned mining claims and old camps, remnants of prospectors who had tried their luck in these mountains and moved on. The silence was profound, broken only by bird calls and the sound of wind in the pines. Finally, as the sun was beginning its descent, they emerged into a clearing, and Clara saw Elijah's cabin. It was larger than she had expected, built of solid logs chinked with moss and mud. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch ran along the front. Behind it, mountains rose in dramatic peaks, and before it, a clear stream tumbled over smooth stones. The clearing itself was maybe half an acre, with a small fenced area that must be a garden, a lean-to shelter for the horses, and a sturdy smokehouse. "It is beautiful," Clara breathed. Elijah dismounted and came to help her down, his hands steadying her as she found her feet. "It is home. Come, I will show you inside." The cabin's interior was one large room with a sleeping loft above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cook stove beside it. Rough-hewn furniture filled the space, clearly handmade but sturdy and well-crafted. Shelves lined another wall, filled with books and trapping supplies. A large bed occupied one corner, covered in furs and wool blankets. Everything was clean and surprisingly organized for a bachelor's dwelling. "This is wonderful, Elijah," Clara said, turning in a slow circle. "You built all of this yourself?" "Over the years, added to it bit by bit." He looked around as though seeing it through her eyes. "I know it is not much." "It is a home, a real home. I love it." Relief flooded his features. "I was worried you would find it too rough." "I have been living in one room above a dress shop, baking in a corner on a tiny stove. This is a palace in comparison." She walked to the bookshelf and examined the titles, a mix of adventure novels, practical guides on trapping and wilderness survival, and surprisingly, poetry. "You read Whitman? Is that strange?" "No, it's wonderful." She pulled down the volume and opened it to a random page, reading aloud. "I exist as I am, that is enough. If no other in the world be aware, I sit content. And if each and all be aware, I sit content." She looked up at him. "Do you sit content, Elijah?" "I did," he said quietly, moving closer. "Before I met you, I thought I was content with my solitary life. Now I know I was just waiting." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, his arms wrapping around her and lifting her nearly off her feet. Clara clung to him, kissing him back with all the passion and promise she felt building between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elijah rested his forehead against hers. "You will sleep in the loft," he said, his voice rough. "I will take the main room. I want to do this properly, Clara. Court you right." "All right," she agreed, touched by his determination to respect her even though every fiber of her being wanted to forget propriety. They spent the evening in comfortable domesticity. Elijah showed her around the clearing, pointing out his various improvements and projects. The garden was impressive, full of hardy vegetables that thrived in the mountain climate. The smokehouse contained strings of preserved meat from his hunting. He had even rigged a simple water system that diverted stream water to a trough near the cabin. "You are completely self-sufficient up here," Clara observed. "Have to be. Nearest neighbor is 10 miles away. In winter, I sometimes do not see another person for months." "Does that not bother you?" "It did not before. But now thinking about winters up here, the thing that bothers me is imagining them without you." Clara slipped her hand into his. "Then you will not have to imagine it, because I am not going anywhere." They ate dinner as the stars emerged, sitting on the porch and watching night settle over the mountains. The silence was different here than in town, deeper and more complete. Clara found she liked it, the way it made room for thoughts to expand, for the soul to breathe. That night, she climbed to the loft and settled into the bed Elijah had prepared for her, covered in soft furs that smelled of mountain air. Below, she could hear him moving around, banking the fire, settling for the night. She felt safe here, in a way she had not felt safe in a long time, wrapped in furs in a cabin in the wilderness with a mountain man who had won her heart with bread purchases and honest words. The next 2 days passed in a golden haze. Elijah took Clara on walks through the forest, showing her his trap lines and teaching her to read animal signs. They fished in the stream and cooked their catch over an open fire. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked for hours, sharing histories and dreams and fears. Clara told him about her mother who had died when she was 16, about the hole that loss had left. Elijah told her about his father's violence and his escape west, about building a life from nothing through sheer determination. "We are both survivors," Clara said on their last evening, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. "We are, but I think we can be more than that together. I think we can be happy." "I think so too." When they rode back to Silver Creek the next day, Clara felt different, more grounded, more certain. The town that had seemed like her whole world now felt small and temporary. The mountains called to her, or perhaps it was the man who lived in them. Over the following weeks, they fell into a new rhythm. Elijah came to town twice a week, always buying Clara's bread, always taking her to coffee or dinner. On weekends, when she could get away, he took her riding into the foothills. They talked about marriage openly now, making plans. Elijah wanted to wait until spring to give her time to be certain and to make preparations. Clara thought spring sounded perfect, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. In late October, as the aspens turned gold and the first snow dusted the high peaks, trouble came to Silver Creek. A gang of outlaws rode into town, 6 men led by a vicious character named Blackjack Sutter, who was wanted in 3 territories. They shot up the main street, robbed the bank, and killed the sheriff who tried to stop them. Clara was in her room when the shooting started. She heard the gunfire and screams and crouched beside her bed, praying it would end. The outlaws took over the saloon, holding several townspeople hostage while they drank and celebrated their successful robbery. A young boy managed to slip away and ran to the livery stable where Elijah happened to be, having just arrived in town. The boy gasped out the story, and Elijah's face went hard as stone. "Where is Clara?" he demanded. "I do not know, sir. I think she is in her room, but I am not sure." Elijah armed himself with his rifle and the large knife he always carried, then moved toward the saloon with deadly purpose. But Blackjack Sutter had posted lookouts. One of them spotted Elijah and fired. The bullet grazed Elijah's shoulder, spinning him around, but he did not go down. He returned fire, and the lookout fell. The gunshot brought the whole gang pouring out of the saloon. Elijah took cover behind a water trough and fired with lethal accuracy. 2 more outlaws went down, but he was outnumbered and wounded, bleeding from his shoulder. Clara, hearing the renewed gunfire, looked out her window and saw Elijah pinned down. Her heart nearly stopped, Without thinking, she grabbed the cast-iron skillet she used for baking and ran down the stairs. Mrs. Morrison, the seamstress, tried to stop her, but Clara pushed past. She emerged onto the street to chaos. Elijah was firing from behind the water trough while 3 remaining outlaws tried to flank him. Blackjack Sutter himself was moving around the side of the general store, clearly planning to come up behind Elijah. Clara did not think. She ran toward Blackjack, her skillet raised. He saw her at the last second and turned, but she swung with all her strength, connecting with his gun hand. Bones cracked and he dropped his pistol with a howl of pain. "You witch!" he snarled, lunging at her with his other hand. But then Elijah was there, moving faster than a man his size should be able to move, especially wounded. He grabbed Blackjack by the collar and threw him to the ground with bone-jarring force. The outlaw tried to rise, but Elijah placed a boot on his chest and leveled his rifle at his head. "Move, and you die," Elijah said, his voice cold as winter ice. The remaining 2 outlaws, seeing their leader captured and half their gang dead or wounded, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Townspeople emerged from hiding, and men rushed to secure the prisoners. Elijah turned to Clara, his face pale beneath his tan, blood soaking his shoulder. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "So could you," she shot back. "I was not going to let that happen." "Clara, do not Clara me, Elijah Stone. You do not get to ride in here and risk your life without me doing the same for you." He stared at her for a long moment, then suddenly laughed, the sound startling everyone around them. "You hit an outlaw with a skillet. It was what I had. You are incredible." He swayed slightly, and Clara realized he was losing blood fast. "Someone get the doctor," she shouted. Then to Elijah, "Sit down before you fall down." He allowed her to guide him to the boardwalk, where he sat heavily. The town doctor, a capable man named Thornton, arrived and examined the wound. "Bullet went clean through. You are lucky. Missed the bone, but you need stitching and rest." They helped Elijah to the doctor's office, Clara walking beside him, holding his hand. Dr. Thornton cleaned and stitched the wound, while Elijah sat stoically, barely flinching. Clara held his other hand the entire time, squeezing hard. "You're staying in town until this heals," she told him firmly. "No arguments." "Yes, ma'am," he said meekly, a slight smile playing at his lips despite the pain. The town put Elijah up in a room at the hotel, courtesy of the grateful bank owner whose money had been recovered. Clara spent every moment she could spare at his side, bringing him food, changing his bandages, reading to him from his beloved Whitman. The whole town was talking about how the mountain man and the widow had helped stop the Sutter gang, elevating them both to local heroes. "I do not like being talked about," Elijah grumbled on the 3rd day of his recovery. "I do not either," Clara agreed. "But it will pass. Towns always find something new to gossip about." He caught her hand, pulling her closer to where he sat propped up in the hotel bed. "You scared 10 years off my life when you ran at that outlaw with your skillet. You scared me first getting yourself shot. I was protecting the town, protecting you. And I was protecting you. We are partners, Elijah. You do not get to be the only brave one." Something shifted in his expression, a deepening of the emotion she saw there. "Partners?" he repeated. "I like that. Clara, I do not want to wait until spring. I do not want to spend another day not being married to you. Life is short and dangerous, and I want you to be my wife now." Clara's heart stuttered. "Are you proposing to me while injured in a hotel bed?" "I'm proposing to you every day for the rest of my life until you say yes, but especially right now, yes." She laughed, tears springing to her eyes. "Yes, Elijah, yes. I will marry you. Tomorrow, next week, whenever you want." "Tomorrow," he said firmly. "We will get the preacher tomorrow." And they did. The next day, as soon as Dr. Thornton cleared Elijah to be up and moving, they walked to the small church at the end of Silver Creek's main street. The preacher, Reverend Williams, was delighted to perform the ceremony. Word spread quickly, and by the time they stood before the altar, half the town had crowded into the small church. Clara wore her blue dress, the one she had worn on their first date, with wildflowers in her hair that Mrs. Muller had insisted on arranging. Elijah wore a clean shirt and vest, his wounded arm in a sling, but his eyes blazing with happiness. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor and cherish each other through all the days of their lives. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah kissed Clara with such tenderness and passion that several of the watching women sighed audibly. Clara kissed him back, pouring all her love and promise into it, and felt complete in a way she never had before. The town threw them an impromptu celebration at the hotel restaurant with donated food and music and dancing. Clara danced with her husband, his arm around her waist, moving slowly because of his injury, but his smile bright enough to light the room. Everyone wanted to congratulate them, to shake Elijah's hand and kiss Clara's cheek. For a man who hated crowds, Elijah bore it with surprising grace, though Clara could feel the tension in his shoulders. Finally, as the evening wore on, they slipped away from the celebration and walked to Clara's room above the dress shop. She had already given notice to Mrs. Morrison that she would be leaving, moving up to the mountain cabin as soon as Elijah was healed enough to travel. "Alone at last," Elijah said, closing the door behind them. Clara turned to face him, her husband, this massive gentle man who had won her heart with bread purchases and honest words and unwavering devotion. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Happier than I have ever been, happier than I knew was possible." He moved toward her, wincing slightly as his shoulder pulled. "Come here, wife." She went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist carefully, mindful of his injury. "We should be careful. You're still healing." "I know, but I need to hold you. Need to know this is real." They stood together in the small room as night deepened outside, holding each other, marveling at how their lives had changed. Clara thought about the woman she had been just 4 months ago, tired and alone and barely surviving. That woman felt like a stranger now. In her place stood someone stronger, someone loved, someone with a future full of possibility. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you too. More than words can say." They stood together for a long time, then carefully, mindfully of his injury, began to discover each other as husband and wife, sealing their vows with tender passion that spoke of promises kept and futures embraced. 2 weeks later, when Dr. Thornton declared Elijah healed enough to travel, they packed up Clara's meager belongings and prepared to leave for the mountain cabin. Clara had sold her bread cart and equipment to a young widow who was looking for a way to support herself, passing on the opportunity that had kept her alive during her darkest days. The transaction felt right, like closing one chapter and opening another. The whole town turned out to see them off. Mrs. Muller pressed a package of coffee and pastries into Clara's hands. Mr. Peterson gave them a set of good steel traps for the trap lines. Even Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife, came to offer her best wishes and a beautiful quilt as a wedding present. "You take care of our hero," she told Elijah, gesturing to Clara. "Always," he promised. They rode out of Silver Creek on a crisp November morning, Clara on Honey and Elijah on his gelding, leading a pack horse loaded with their belongings. As they climbed into the mountains, Clara turned once to look back at the town that had been her home for a year. It looked small and distant already, fading into memory. "Regrets?" Elijah asked, watching her face. "None. I'm going home." The ride to the cabin took most of the day, but Clara no longer felt nervous or uncertain. She felt anticipation building as they climbed higher, as the air grew cleaner and the silence deeper. When they finally emerged into the clearing and saw the cabin waiting, smoke curling from the chimney where Elijah had left a fire, banked, Clara felt rightness settle into her bones. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," Elijah said, dismounting and coming to help her down. "Mrs. Stone," Clara repeated, testing the name. "I like how that sounds." They settled quickly into married life. Clara took charge of the cabin, adding small touches that made it feel more like a home. She sewed curtains from fabric she had brought, arranged their books more neatly on the shelves, and planted herbs in pots near the sunny window. Elijah taught her the skills she would need to survive mountain winters, how to preserve meat, how to read weather signs, how to shoot his rifle accurately in case of bear or mountain lion. November turned to December, and the first real snows came, transforming the clearing into a wonderland of white. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the town until spring thaw. But Clara did not mind. She had Elijah, had their warm cabin, had the profound peace of the mountains. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and read aloud to each other, or simply talked, sharing thoughts and dreams in the flickering light. One evening in late December, as the year drew to a close, Clara was kneading bread dough on the cabin table while Elijah repaired a trap by the fire. She had continued to bake, though now only for the two of them and the occasional neighbor who braved the mountain trails to visit. Her hands worked the dough with practiced rhythm, and she found herself smiling. "What are you thinking about?" Elijah asked, looking up from his work. "About how you used to buy all my bread, every single loaf, do you remember?" "Of course I remember. Best investment I ever made." "What did you do with all of it? You could not possibly have eaten it all." He looked slightly sheepish. "I gave most of it away, to the miners up in the camps, to travelers passing through, to anyone who needed it. Told them it came from the best baker in Montana Territory, and they should remember that." Clara stopped kneading, staring at him. "You were promoting my business, even then? I wanted people to know you were worth supporting, and I wanted an excuse to see you every day." He set down his trap and came to stand beside her. "That bread brought us together. Clara, I will always be grateful for it." She wiped flour from her hands and reached up to cup his bearded face. "I am grateful for you, for your kindness and your patience and the way you saw me when I was invisible to myself." "You were never invisible. You were the brightest thing in that whole town." He kissed her, deep and slow, and Clara melted into him. Even after months together, his touch still made her heart race, still made her feel cherished and desired and completely safe. The winter passed in quiet contentment. They celebrated Christmas with a simple exchange of handmade gifts, Elijah presenting Clara with a beautiful wooden chest he had carved with intricate mountain scenes, Clara giving him a new leather vest she had sewn herself. They rang in the new year of 1877, wrapped in furs before the fire, talking about the future. "I want children someday," Clara said, resting her head on Elijah's shoulder. "If we are blessed with them. I want that too. A cabin full of little ones, learning to love the mountains like I do." He paused. "Will you miss town? Miss having neighbors close?" "No, I have everything I need right here, though I suppose we will visit sometimes. Spring and fall, for supplies and to trade pelts. We can stay a few days, see friends. But this, Clara, this is our home, our life." "It is perfect," she said, and meant it. Spring came with dramatic suddenness, snow melting into rushing streams, wildflowers exploding across the meadows. Elijah took Clara with him on his trap lines, teaching her his routes and techniques. She proved an apt student, quick to learn and unafraid of the hard work. They hiked for miles through magnificent country, often camping under the stars, making love in their tent with the sounds of the wilderness around them. In May, they made their first trip back to Silver Creek since their wedding. The town greeted them warmly, everyone wanting to know how they were managing in the mountains. Clara visited with Mrs. Muller and the other women she had befriended, while Elijah sold his winter pelts and bought supplies. They stayed 3 days, which was about Elijah's limit for civilization, then gratefully headed back to their mountain sanctuary. That summer and fall passed in a golden blur of happiness. Clara planted a larger garden, putting up vegetables for winter. Elijah built an addition onto the cabin, creating a separate room that could serve as a pantry or, perhaps someday, a nursery. They explored the mountains together, Elijah showing her secret places of breathtaking beauty, hidden waterfalls and alpine meadows and vistas that seemed to stretch forever. In October, Clara realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but wanted to be certain before telling Elijah. When she finally did, standing by the stream on a golden autumn afternoon, his face transformed with joy, so pure it brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he breathed, dropping to his knees and pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, running her fingers through his hair. Happy does not even begin to cover it. He looked up at her, his pale blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "You have given me everything, Clara. A home, a purpose, a family. I never thought I would have these things." "We gave them to each other," she corrected gently, "and now we get to share them with a child." The winter of 1877 to 78 passed with Clara growing steadily rounder and Elijah growing steadily more protective. He insisted she rest more, worry less, let him handle all the heavy work. Clara found his hovering both endearing and occasionally frustrating. She understood it came from love and perhaps a bit of fear. They were far from town, from doctors, and spring babies in the mountains carried risks. But Clara felt strong and healthy, her body taking to pregnancy with surprising ease. She continued to bake, to help with chores, to walk in the snow when the weather permitted. Elijah read to her in the evenings, adventure novels and poetry, his deep voice soothing as the baby moved and kicked inside her. In April, with the snow melting but the trails still difficult, Clara went into labor. Elijah had arranged for a midwife from a neighboring homestead to come stay with them for the last weeks, a capable woman named Sarah who had delivered dozens of mountain babies. Clara labored through the night, Elijah holding her hand and whispering encouragement, while Sarah directed the process with calm competence. At dawn, as the first birds began singing and sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, Clara gave birth to a healthy, squalling boy. Elijah, you choose. You did all the hard work. Clara thought about it, about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Thomas, she said softly, for my first husband, who brought me west even if he did not live to see what that meant, and Elijah for his middle name, for the man who gave me a real home and a real life. Elijah looked at her with such love it felt like a physical touch. Thomas Elijah Stone. It is a strong name, a good name. He carefully placed the baby in Clara's arms, then kissed them both. My family. My whole world right here. Thomas proved to be a healthy, happy baby who grew rapidly under his parents' devoted care. Clara marveled at the sight of her huge, rough mountain man husband cradling their son, singing to him in that deep voice, carrying him in a sling against his broad chest while he did chores. Elijah was a natural father, patient and gentle and endlessly loving. That summer, they made the trip to Silver Creek to show off the baby. The town celebrated with them, everyone wanting to meet little Thomas and congratulate the proud parents. Reverend Williams blessed the baby at a special service, and Mrs. Muller hosted a party at the cafe with a beautiful cake she had baked. You look happy, Mrs. Muller told Clara, holding Thomas and cooing at him. Mountain life agrees with you. I am happy, Clara confirmed, happier than I ever dreamed possible. They returned to their cabin, to their peaceful mountain life. The years began to pass in a rhythm of seasons. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious boy who loved the mountains as much as his father did. When Thomas was 3, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after the midwife who had helped deliver Thomas. 2 years after Sarah came another son, Daniel, and 2 years after Daniel, a final daughter, Anna. The cabin had been expanded multiple times now, with separate rooms for the children and a larger main area. Elijah had built beds and tables and chairs, all sturdy and well-crafted. Clara had sewn quilts and curtains and clothes, creating a home that was warm and welcoming despite its remote location. The children grew up wild and free, learning to ride and track and survive in the wilderness. Elijah taught them respect for the land and the animals, how to take only what they needed, how to read the mountain's moods. Clara taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, using books ordered from catalogs and teaching them around the kitchen table. They made trips to Silver Creek twice a year, enough to keep the children from becoming complete hermits, but not so often that they lost their love for the mountain life. Thomas grew tall like his father, with the same dark hair and pale blue eyes. He was quiet and competent, learning his father's trade of trapping and hunting with natural aptitude. Sarah was fierce and independent, able to outshoot her brothers by the time she was 12. Daniel was the gentle one, more interested in books and drawing than in wilderness skills, though he learned them anyway. And little Anna was pure joy, laughing and singing and bringing light to every corner of their lives. Years passed. Thomas turned 18, then 20. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman who attracted attention from boys in town, but seemed in no hurry to marry. Daniel left for Denver at 19 to study art, something that hurt Elijah initially, until Clara reminded him that they had always said their children could choose their own paths. He came home every summer, bringing his sketches and paintings of city life, and though he loved Denver, everyone could see he loved the mountains more. Clara and Elijah grew older together, their love deepening and maturing like fine wine. Their hair turned gray, their faces lined with years and weather, but they remained devoted to each other with the same intensity they had felt that first summer when he bought all her bread and won her heart. One evening in the spring of 1895, nearly 20 years after their wedding, Clara and Elijah sat on the porch of their mountain home, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. The children were grown now, Thomas running his own trap lines, Sarah courting a nice young man from town, Daniel in Denver but planning to move back, Anna still at home at 16 but making her own plans. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, holding Elijah's hand. "Giving up your solitary life for all of this chaos?" Elijah squeezed her fingers gently. "Not for one single second. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams, Clara. A family, a purpose, a reason to wake up grateful every morning. You gave me the same. I was just surviving before you, just putting one foot in front of the other. You taught me how to live. We taught each other." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Remember that first morning when I bought all your bread? I thought you were insane. 10 loaves for one man. I was insane, crazy in love with a widow who looked at me like I was a normal person instead of a wild mountain man." Clara laughed, the sound warm and rich. "You are a wild mountain man. You are just my wild mountain man." "Always," he promised, kissing the top of her head. "From that first loaf to the last breath I take, I am yours." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one, diamonding the deep blue sky. Inside the cabin they could hear Anna singing while she prepared dinner, her voice sweet and clear. The evening air was cool and clean, scented with pine and wildflowers. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called and another answered. "It has been a good life," Clara said softly. "The best life," Elijah agreed, "and it is not over yet. We have years still ahead of us, grandchildren to meet, adventures to have." "More adventures? Are you not tired of adventures?" He grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face into something boyish. "Never. As long as I have you beside me, I am ready for anything." True to his word, the adventures continued. Thomas married a sweet girl from Silver Creek and brought her to live near his parents, building his own cabin just a mile down the valley. Sarah eventually married her young man and moved to a ranch on the other side of the mountains, but visited regularly. Daniel returned from Denver and built a studio cabin where he painted landscapes that began to sell well in galleries back east. And Anna, wild Anna, fell in love with a horse rancher and moved to Wyoming, writing long letters about her new life that Clara read aloud by firelight. Grandchildren came, first 1, then 3, then 6 in total. The mountain clearing that had once been so solitary and quiet now rang with the shouts and laughter of children playing, of family gatherings that filled the cabin to bursting. Elijah, now in his 60s but still strong and capable, taught his grandchildren the same lessons he had taught his own children, passing on the skills and values that had guided his life. Clara baked bread still, her hands remembering the rhythms even as they grew more lined and stiff with age. She baked for her family, for neighbors, sometimes sending loaves to town with Thomas or Sarah. People said Mrs. Clara Stone made the best bread in Montana Territory, had for years, and she smiled at the compliment, but knew the truth. Her bread was good because it was made with love, kneaded with hope, baked with the knowledge that she had been given a second chance at life, and she was grateful for every moment. On a golden afternoon in September 1905, Clara and Elijah celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the mountain cabin, 3 generations of Stone family filling the clearing with life and love. Tables were set up outside, laden with food. Children ran and played while adults talked and laughed. A fiddle player from town provided music, and couples danced on the grass. Clara and Elijah stood at the center of it all, holding hands, watching their legacy unfold around them. Thomas was teaching his oldest son to skip stones in the stream. Sarah was helping Anna's daughter braid her hair. Daniel was sketching the scene, capturing it for posterity. The grandchildren were playing a raucous game of tag, their shouts echoing off the mountain walls. "Look what we built," Clara said, tears streaming down her face, but happy tears, joyful tears. "Look what came from one summer morning and too many loaves of bread." Elijah wrapped his arms around her, holding her close against his still solid chest. His hair was completely white now, his face deeply lined, but his blue eyes were as bright and clear as they had been 30 years ago. "We built a family, built a life that matters. And it all started because I could not stop staring at the most beautiful woman I had ever seen and had to find an excuse to talk to her." "Best excuse ever," Clara said, laughing through her tears. B. Best decision I ever made was walking up to your cart that morning. Second best decision was buying all your bread. What was the third best decision? Asking you to have coffee with me. And the fourth was proposing on our first proper date. And the fifth was marrying you as soon as possible. And every decision after that involved loving you more deeply every single day. Clara turned in his arms and kissed him, there in front of their entire family, kissing her husband of 30 years with all the passion and devotion she had felt from the beginning. The gathered family cheered and applauded, the grandchildren making exaggerated gagging noises that made everyone laugh. "Speech!" Thomas called out. "Father, you need to make a speech!" Elijah groaned but released Clara and turned to face the assembled family. He was not a man of many words, never had been, but he cleared his throat and spoke from the heart. 30 years ago, I was alone in these mountains, convinced that solitary was the same as content. Then I met your mother, your grandmother, and she showed me I was wrong. She showed me that life is meant to be shared, that love is the greatest adventure, and that family is everything. Everything I am, everything we have built here, started with her courage and her strength and her willingness to take a chance on a rough mountain man who loved her at first sight. So here is to Clara, my wife, my partner, my everything. And here is to all of you, the proof that love can build something beautiful and lasting. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being our family. The family erupted in applause and cheers. Clara was crying openly now, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Her children hugged her grandchildren climbed into her lap, and Elijah stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, his rock, her anchor, her love. As the sun set behind the mountains and the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, the family gathered around a bonfire. Someone produced a guitar and they sang old songs, the kind Clara remembered from her childhood in Pennsylvania. The grandchildren roasted marshmallows and told stories. The adults reminisced about past adventures and planned future gatherings. Clara sat between Elijah and Thomas, her husband's hand holding hers, her son's shoulder warm against hers, and felt the profound peace of a life well lived. She'd been a widow selling bread from a cart, struggling to survive, alone and afraid. And then a mountain man had bought every loaf, and in doing so, had bought his way into her heart and changed everything. She looked at Elijah, this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had valued her when she felt worthless, who had loved her with fierce devotion and gentle tenderness for 30 years. His face was turned toward the fire, the flames painting dancing shadows across his weathered features, and she saw traces of the younger man he had been, but loved this older version even more. As though feeling her gaze, he turned and met her eyes. No words were necessary. Everything they needed to say was there in that look, in 30 years of shared life, in the family surrounding them, in the mountains that had been their home and witness to their love story. "I love you," she mouthed silently. "I love you too," he mouthed back, squeezing her hand. The fire burned down to embers. Children were carried to beds. Adults drifted off to the various cabins and tents set up for the gathering. Finally, it was just Clara and Elijah sitting by the dying fire under a canopy of stars so bright and numerous they looked like scattered diamonds. "Ready for bed, Mrs. Stone?" Elijah asked. "Ready, Mr. Stone." They walked to their cabin, the home they had built together, filled with memories and love. Inside, everything was familiar and dear, from Elijah's books on the shelves to Clara's quilts on the bed to the photographs of their family adorning every surface. They prepared for bed in comfortable silence, the easy movements of two people who knew each other completely. Lying in bed, wrapped in Elijah's arms like she had been for 30 years, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a dusty street in Silver Creek to this mountain sanctuary, from widow and mountain man to husband and wife, parents and grandparents, from surviving to thriving, from alone to surrounded by love. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Elijah's voice rumbled in his chest beneath her ear. "For buying all my bread, for seeing me, for loving me, for this life. Thank you for making the bread, for taking a chance on me, for saying yes, for this life." He kissed the top of her head. "Sleep now. We have more years ahead of us, more adventures to have. More grandchildren to spoil, Clara added, smiling. More sunsets to watch. More stories to tell. More love to share. Always more love, Clara agreed, and let sleep take her, safe and warm in the arms of the man who had won her heart with bread purchases and honest words and became her everything. Years continued to pass. Clara and Elijah grew older still, moving more slowly but still active, still engaged with their family and their mountain life. Thomas took over most of the trapping business, but Elijah still went out occasionally, unable to fully give up the work that had defined so much of his life. Clara baked less frequently but still produced loaves for special occasions, for grandchildren's birthdays and family gatherings. In the spring of 1912, as Clara turned 60 and Elijah turned 69, they sat together on their porch watching yet another sunset paint the sky. Their hands were gnarled now, Clara's with arthritis and Elijah's with old injuries and age, but they still fit together perfectly, fingers intertwined. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Clara asked. "Tell me." "That first morning when you bought all my bread, how I thought you were strange and probably wasteful, how I could not understand why anyone would need 10 loaves. Elijah chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "I thought I was being clever. Thought I was hiding how completely captivated I was by you. You were not very subtle." "No. But it worked, did it not?" "It worked," Clara agreed. "Best $4 you ever spent. Best $4 anyone ever spent. That bread bought me a lifetime of happiness." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared. Inside the cabin, they could hear Sarah, who was visiting with her husband, preparing dinner. The smell of cooking meat and vegetables drifted out, homey and comforting. "I have been blessed," Clara said softly, "beyond measure, beyond what I ever dreamed possible. And it all started with you, Elijah, with your kindness and your courage to approach a struggling widow and offer help in a way that let me keep my dignity." "You gave me a reason to be more than just a mountain man," Elijah replied. "Gave me purpose and family and love. We saved each other, Clara. That is the truth of it." "We did," she agreed. "We absolutely did." As the years rolled on into the 1910s and beyond, Clara and Elijah remained fixtures in their mountain community, beloved by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who began to arrive. They were living legends, the mountain man and his bread-baking wife, who had built an empire of love in the wilderness. They passed within months of each other, both in their 70s, Clara first in her sleep one peaceful autumn night, and Elijah following that winter, his heart giving out while he sat in his chair by the fire. The family mourned, but celebrated too, knowing that two people who had loved each other so completely were together again, wherever souls went after leaving the mountains. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery on the mountain near their cabin, with headstones that read simply, "Clara Stone, 1852 to 1924. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She made the best bread and the best life, Elijah Stone, 1843 to 1924. Beloved husband, father, grandfather, mountain man, true heart." And every year, on the anniversary of their wedding, the family gathered at the mountain cabin, now maintained as a family homestead. And someone, usually the youngest child present, baked bread using Clara's original recipe. They shared the loaves and told the story of how a widow selling bread from a cart met a mountain man who bought every loaf and won her heart, and how that simple transaction had grown into a legacy of love that spanned generations. The mountains stood eternal witness, the streams still sang their ancient songs, and in the cabin where Clara and Elijah had built their life, love lingered in every corner, in every board and stone, a testament to two people who had found each other against the odds and created something beautiful and lasting from flower and courage and open hearts. Their great-great-grandchildren still visit the cabin, still tell the story, still bake the bread. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sunset paints the peaks in rose and gold, visitors swear they can see two figures sitting on the porch, holding hands, watching the mountains they loved, together for eternity as they were always meant to be. The end